Hello and welcome. My name is Father Matthew Carnes, and I'm an associate professor of government here at Georgetown University, and I'm also the director of our Center for Latin American Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on the panorama of religious freedom and practice in Cuba. I want to begin by thanking today's co-sponsors for helping to make this event possible: Outreach Aid to the Americas, Georgetown University's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Democracy and Governance Program, and the Center for Latin American Studies. I'd also like to thank our audience for tuning in via Zoom and to those joining us on YouTube and Facebook Live. This event will be recorded and it will be posted for later viewing on the Berkley Center's website. So if you registered for today's event, you'll receive an email notification once it's posted. Now, the topic that gathers us is one of long-standing importance: religious freedom in Cuba. According to the country's constitution, the state recognizes, respects, and guarantees religious liberty, and, quote, distinct beliefs and religions enjoy equal consideration. The Constitution further prohibits discrimination based on religious beliefs. It declares the country to be a secular state and provides for the separation of religious institutions in the state. The Constitution also recognizes, respects, and guarantees people's freedom of thought, conscience, and expression, provides for the right to profess or not profess religious beliefs, to change them and to practice the religion of their choice, but only with required respect to other beliefs and in accordance with the law. Now, nevertheless, and despite these guarantees in the Constitution, religious actors have often encountered significant challenges in freely practicing their religion, as well as in their management of institutions and resources. One particularly important aspect of religious life in Cuba, which I'm sure we'll touch upon today, is the need for registration by religious groups. The law of associations requires all religious groups to apply to the Ministry of Justice for official registration. The ministry then registers religious denominations as associations on a basis similar to how it officially registers other civil society organizations. The application process requires that they identify their location of their activities, their proposed leadership, and their funding sources, and many other requirements. Ineligibilities for registration may include determinations by the ministry that another group has identical or similar objectives, or that the group's activities could, quote, harm the common good. Now, beyond this process, the United States Department of State also reports that many religious groups have directly experienced, quote, threats, detentions, violence, and other coercive tactics to restrict their group's activities and their leaders' and followers' activities. And this has occurred even in recent years. And yet, despite all this, the country shows a remarkably vibrant religious landscape. The Catholic Church estimates that about 60% of the population of 11 million people identify as Catholic. Membership in Protestant churches is estimated at about 5%. According to some observers, Pentecostals and Baptists are likely the largest Protestant denominations. The Assemblies of God reports approximately 150,000 members. The four Baptist conventions estimate their combined membership at more than 100,000. Evangelical Protestant groups continue to grow in the country. The Jewish community estimates it has about 1,200 members, about 1,000 of whom reside in Havana, and the local Islamic League claims about 2,000 to 3,000 Muslims in the country. So what is the situation on the ground today in Cuba? And how should we think about the role of religion in the island nation? We're fortunate to have two experts with us today who can speak to these important topics. First, Ahmed Shaheed is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. He's also the Deputy Director of the University of Essex Human Rights Center. He was the first Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran since the termination of the previous Commission on Human Rights mandate in 2002. He's a career diplomat. He's twice held the office of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Maldives and led Maldives' efforts to embrace international human rights standards between 2003 and 2011. In 2015, Dr. Shaheed won the UN Foundation Leo Nevis Human Rights Global Leadership Award. And also joining us, Katherine Marshall. She's a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a professor of the practice of development, conflict, and religion in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. She helped to create and now serves as the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. She's also vice president of the G20 Interfaith Association. She's worked at the World Bank from 1971 to 2006. She has nearly 5 decades of experience on a wide range of development issues in Latin America, Africa, East Asia, and the Middle East. She led the World Bank's Faith and Ethics Initiative between 2000 and 2006. So we're delighted to have both of you join us, Dr. Shaheed, Dr. Marshall. After our moderated discussion, we'll have a chance to take some questions from the Zoom audience. And so I would ask our participants to please start to submit questions through the Q&A feature inside your Zoom screen that will allow us to collect your questions and have them ready at the go. So I'd like to begin today with Dr. Shaheed. Can you speak about the situation and issues as you understand them on the ground in Cuba now, and in particular from your role, the vantage point you have as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief? Again, welcome.
Thank you, and good morning all. Thank you, Berkley Center and co-sponsors, for inviting me to make a presentation to you about the situation in Cuba and, of course, about my work as UN Special Rapporteur. It's an honor to join you, Professors Katherine Marshall and Reverend Matthew Carnes, for this event. Before I address the situation in Cuba, let me just frame my talk in the basis of the broader approach of my work and the issues I address in my role as UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. The importance of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief to self-development, the search for truth, democratic legitimation, and the protection of other human rights is self-evident. And clearly, the full enjoyment of this right is dependent on myriad other rights, including the freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly, the right to privacy, and the right to non-discrimination, among others. As a right that is both foundational to and independent on the wider human rights framework, the global pushback on human rights generally has deepened the worldwide crisis of the right to freedom of religion or belief. The ability of believers and non-believers to manifest their faith or convictions faces serious threats from state and non-state actors alike. Members of faith-based communities, as well as dissidents, are often confronted with state and non-state actor-induced threats to their freedom and safety and security. Available data suggests that the prevalence of laws, policies, and government actions that restrict the ability of rights holders to enjoy freedom of religion or belief is increasing. Communications transmitted to states by my mandate since 2015 illustrate that states employ a range of extra legal measures that violate freedom of religion or belief, which also serve to delegitimize and stigmatize certain religious or belief groups, typically minorities and dissenters. Such measures include restrictions on the establishment of places of worship and the forced closure of such houses of worship, maintenance of humanitarian institutions and associations or the blocking of them, impediments on the training and appointment of faith leaders, celebration of holidays and ceremonies, teaching of religion or beliefs, and use of materials related to customs or belief, including confiscation of Bibles and other holy books. The top three concerns raised in the communications that are sent to governments in 2015, some 200 plus communications, are three. One, restrictions on the peaceful expression of religion or belief. Two, use of criminal sanctions to limit association with censored groups. And three, administrative measures that limit the peaceful existence of certain religious or belief groups. It must be noted that the range of issues on which communications focus do not cover the full spectrum of violations on the ground, as regrettably, access to human rights mechanisms remains elusive for many survivors of violations. I would like to note that the ever-evolving nature of state-religion relationships is of significance to those seeking to promote protections for freedom of religion or belief, because the degree to which states are entangled with various religions or beliefs has far-reaching implications for their disposition and ability to be an impartial guarantor of everybody's human rights, including right to freedom of religion or belief. State-religion relationships are incredibly diverse and complex, but in general terms, three broad types of state-religion models are discernible and provide a useful analytical basis to discuss the challenges the states face in promoting and protecting freedom of religion or belief. So these three types are, broadly speaking, one, states with an official or favored religion or religions, states with no identification towards a religion, and finally, states that pursue policies to heavily restrict the role of religion. In other words, states that are hostile towards religion altogether. All states, regardless of their relationship with religion, face challenges in the field of human rights. However, aspects of two state religion models discussed in the report I submitted to the UN a few years back, appear highly incompatible with the state's obligations to be an impartial guarantor of everyone's human rights. These include those that can be called religious states, so those that have a strong attachment to religion and seek to enforce religious teachings through laws, and those with a negative view or hostile view of religion, of the role of religion in public life. The extent to which states support an official religion, the degree to which they enforce that religion, extent to which they control, regulate, and restrict religion pose significant implications for states' disposition to guarantee equal rights to everybody. On the other hand, states with a negative view of religion tend to impose restrictions on all or most religions, including those held by the majority community in that country. Ironically, even though they represent polar opposite models in terms of support for the role of religion in public life, states that enforce religion and those that heavily restrict religion are both motivated to establish a monopoly for their ideologies, and as such, often require force and generally involve discrimination against those that do not share the views held by those in power. States that most heavily restrict religion, which arguably includes Cuba, view religion as something negative that should be expurgated from public spaces and generally respond with severe restrictions on the civic space. The legal framework of these states can involve commitment to secularity, freedom of religion or belief, or even to a particular religion. But some of these states ban the role of religion in public life altogether, while others allow for nominal freedom of worship. But the hallmark of these states is their propensity for imposing very tight restrictions on the legal status, funding, autonomy, and political activities of these actors and institutions for the purposes of limiting the role of religion, especially in public, at times in private life as well. Frequently associated with state-promoted atheism, the authorities in these states pursue a highly restrictive policy towards religion. The underlying features of this model is that the state intends to control religion, both in public and at times private spheres. Regulations are enforced to keep religion out of public life. Authorities cultivate a negative identification towards any religion. In other words, the obligation to accommodate everyone's right to enjoy freedom of belief is not respected and is just flagrantly violated. Ironically, such state behavior is unfamiliar. It's not unfamiliar to the polar opposite of this model. In other words, religious states and where religion is enforced upon individuals, and these states share some commonalities. The top 8 recipients of communications issued to the states by my mandate over the past 15, 20 years represent these two groups. They constitute the highest number of recipients of communications or allegation letters and urgent appeals about cases pending or violations occurring in those states. In both these cases, the state embodies a sacredness where no other religion or belief should rival the established state ideology. As a result, the overall context of these states is repressive and contains elements of coercion. Restrictions on religious practices are often articulated in the name of ensuring equality for all citizens. However, equal opportunities for individuals to enjoy these rights may be non-existent. In fact, all forms of individual freedoms are sacrificed in the name of collective equality. In other words, equality is sought without any care for freedom. These states tend to impose high levels of restrictions, resulting in a wide range of violations of religious freedom. Moreover, other interdependent and mutually reinforcing rights are also violated along with these, such as freedoms of opinion, expression, peaceful assembly, and association. Among the most notorious examples of this intersection of rights is the ability to express views and to express, write, publish, disseminate, or import religious publications, as well as to practice these rights in community with others. Censorship of the press, media, and publications restrain a whole range of these and other linked rights. Proselytizing is also commonly banned for all religious groups. Private or public observance of religious practices, worship or customs are frequently proscribed. Similarly, this applies to accessing and building places of worship. In some countries, attendance at places of worship is restricted by age and by location, or the observance of certain religious practices, such as those linked to diet or fasting. And these may be prohibited as well. Limitations on the freedom of movement might result in restrictions on travel overseas for the performance of faith-based or faith-in activities such as pilgrimages. These states also commonly interfere in the internal arrangements of the faith community, such as in the appointment of clerics or language, content, and duration of religious services. In some cases, The state may designate a religious leader for a community while persecuting the spiritual leader appointed by the community itself. Likewise, the state may even set up an official religious organization for the purpose of controlling rather than supporting that community. The general culture of control is such that countries do not provide space for places where a discursive challenge to some authority can flourish. In other words, religion is seen as a threat, and any peaceful engagement, independent engagement by faith-based actors is seen as a threat to established authority in that particular state. Restrictions imposed on the manifestation of religion either exceed the test of proportionality or cite the grounds not given in international law for limitations, such as national unity, religious harmony, or sowing division among the people and religions. Interestingly, such arguments are often linked to security arguments and designed to suppress belief altogether. In other words, belief is suppressed in the name of national security. New religious groups are often declared dangerous to national security. Arrests for religious activities are carried out, and officials acting in the name of religion or members of the families are put in detention or suffer other forms of harassment, including arbitrary deprivation of life or extrajudicial killings. Generally, education on religious matters is tightly controlled. For example, direct government control of teachers and restrictions on the running of religious schools. Censorship is based on general laws might restrict the availability of literature based on religion, save those that are officially sanctioned by the state, that too subject to severe inspection and censorship. Anti-religious propaganda can appear in official or semi-official government publications, again, as a form of harassing faith-based communities who want to act independently. Discriminatory or burdensome registration, as Reverend Matthew Carnes has mentioned, requirements this may be imposed on faith-based organizations, making it almost impossible to register as an organization. These may include, but not limited to, setting a very high bar for eligibility in regard to the numbers of members required for registration, the geographic spread or length of presence in the country of members who are filing for a registration, or requiring the registration application be signed by all members of the organization, including detailed personal information, which of course could endanger those members. Or that association can only operate at the address identified in the registration documents and also a designated place and nowhere else. Or they require a frequent renewal of the registration, again, to restrict and limit the freedom to operate as a faith-based organization. Depriving a religious or belief community of legal status can have a tremendous impact on the collective aspects of the right to freedom of belief, including the ability of adherents to practice their faith together with others, jeopardizing the viability of the community's existence in that country. Absence of legal personality also raises questions of the property ownership for those communities, including those functions which function as places of worship and education. Again, that can directly affect the collective dimension of the human right to freedom of religion or belief. Now, these all look very familiar from the Cuban context. So let me now move to the Cuban context. The government of Cuba can lay claim to many of the hallmarks of these restrictions that I just outlined before. Chief among them has been its secularist approach to faith-based communities and influences that it deems contrary to the communist ideals and morals norms of the country. Such an approach has perpetuated widespread violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief over the years and obscured the path forward for meaningful reforms that result in substantive protections for the right to freedom of religion or belief of people in the country. Cuba's recent reforms, for example, resulted in the official recognition of rights to private property, of non-discrimination on the basis of race, religion, ethnic origin, and gender disability, and bolstering certain safeguards. These all represent welcome improvements to structural protections for rights in the country. Yet, as many have noted, protections for religious freedom in this new constitution were notably, have declined from the previous positions that they had enjoyed in the previous constitution. The government's approach has further translated into serious and legitimate incursions against rights of belief communities in the day-to-day lives of Cuban citizens. Registration of faith-based organizations, as well as many aspects of the manifestation of religious belief, are closely monitored and often restricted by the State Office of Religious Affairs, or ORA, and the Ministry of Justice. Many religious communities find their registration bid rejected through an opaque process with vague justification cited, resulting in the criminalizing of the manifestation of these groups in their communities. Even where registration is granted, the need for constant permission from ORA for any activity outside of a regular service creates an impossible situation for religious communities and represents an onerous and flagrant undermining of their right to exercise religious freedom. Meanwhile, advocates have reported to me that religious leaders in Cuba, particularly those who seek to exercise or advocate for myriad rights, find themselves victims of campaigns of intimidation, harassment, or surveillance from state security and law enforcement officers, subject to arbitrary detention and arrest, domestic international travel bans, and seizure and destruction of property, including house of worship. Worse still, this brazen target of communities on the basis of their faith is on the rise, nearly some 72% in the past 2 years alone. We must send the message that these violations of fundamental rights have to end and will not be tolerated with impunity. Cuba is therefore a state that I have been paying increasing attention as a mandate holder. Over the course of this year, the OAA and CSW have engaged with my mandate to draw attention to the situation on the island. And I have raised these concerns in the work of the mandate. Additionally, I have been pushing for a country visit, which would mark the second official country visit by my mandate to any country in the region in 3 decades. Unfortunately, the Cuban state remains hesitant to constructively engage my mandate on these issues to date, and they remain very hostile towards the mandate's activities in various thematic reporting to the Council. Nonetheless, there are opportunities for change and accountability in the prevailing climate in Cuba. In this respect, the advocacy work of civil society combined with work of my and other mandates at the UN can have a mutually reinforcing and beneficial effect. But I can only visit a country at their invitation. I hope the contents of my reports and communications can draw attention globally to the work of rights defenders on the ground. They, in turn, can increase the normative penalty of a state may face for failing to engage with UN human rights mechanisms. By engaging with my mandate, the government tacitly engages with the work of civil society actors and faith-based organizations whom I rely on, and I think they are therefore empowered to further impact on the normative environment and secure greater accountability for the rights violations that they experience. The global imperatives for security and democracy, promoting development and advancing peace and security cannot be met amid widespread violations of human rights, including undue restrictions on religious freedom. The strongest rejoinder is the content human rights work of human rights activists, advocates, and defenders as yourselves, who work to spotlight the violations and combat these narratives wherever they may occur. Often, faith communities provide the best hope of implementing the messages of equality and inclusivity within societies that will help ensure an individual's right to non-discrimination and to practice their religion or belief. Yet the task of promoting and protecting religious freedom may appear a complex and at times almost overwhelming undertaking when considered in light of this interdependence with other human rights generally. This is the result, however, of the comparative isolation of this right in human rights framework. For too long, freedom of thought, conscience, and belief has been relegated to a class of its own, only of concern to specific faith actors and only deployed to defend specific faith communities. To the extent that religious freedom is in effect securing the enjoyment of a vast ambit of other human rights, there exists an imperative to forge broad coalitions of faith-based and secular actors alike. This represents a powerful but as yet largely unrealized force for change and accountability. It is also important to ensure that such collaborative networks commit to the rights and freedoms as enshrined international human rights framework. It is not based on a relativized version of such rights, but on the international human rights framework as articulated by UDHR and the ICCPR. Failure to do so may actually undermine the enjoyment of various rights, including freedom of religion or belief. But we must also strive to address the gaps between the principles that are internationally outlined and norms which says that Cuba commit and the practice they actually employ at home. In other words, the gap between their commitments on international human rights law, the norms they commit through treaties, and their practice at home. Civil society actors must continue to monitor and document rights violations. They need to continue to build the capacity of marginalized and vulnerable communities to advance evidence-based reporting of human rights violations with the aim of advocating on behalf of victims for remedy. I look forward to working with you, and I remain committed on my mandate to looking at more closely at Cuba's violations, and to say how I can work with you to increase accountability and force change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for those comments, Dr. Shaheed, and I really appreciate both your attention to the overall framework, how we should think about religious freedom and restrictions on it. Cuba, in particular, in some of its violations of those standards, and then finally a sense of the importance of this for democracy and for the kinds of governance we'd like to see. It's a really important overview for us. I'd like to turn now to Professor Marshall. Professor Marshall, you've been working on these issues of religion and religion's role in development, role in conflict settings, role in politics. Can you speak to us from your perspective on both the Cuba case and more broadly the case of religious freedom?
Well, I'm stepping back, and my role is to address some of the big questions that are involved. I have to say one reason I agreed to speak today was so that I would learn more about Cuba, because it is one of the countries, actually one of the few countries in this area that I have not been able to visit, and hope very much that I will be able to do so. But the work that I have been doing over the last 20 years is really addressing three different questions. And then I'm going to speak to three different concepts that we're wrestling with. So the first question is, what's religion got to do with it? So in terms of Cuba's political model, its economic models, its development models, I think one of the questions we're trying to address here is, what difference does it make that Cuba has a religious history, that it has a religious present, and so forth. So that's the first question. Then the second question, which is also one that Ahmed has been addressing, is why does it matter? Why is this important? What is missing from healthcare policy, education policy, development of local government institutions, intellectual grappling spiritual care that people, we know now from the COVID pandemic, is so critically important. And then the third question is, what does that mean in terms of policy? Which raises maybe some of the more difficult questions of what is involved here. So with the three concepts, the three that I'm going to reflect on a bit and then try to relate them a little bit with mostly questions, which hopefully Father Matt and Ahmed will be responding to. The first one is the notion of religious engagement. And what does that mean? The second is religious freedom. And as it's understood internationally, and particularly in Europe, as freedom of religion or belief. And then finally, religious literacy. So maybe let me start with the last one, religious literacy. And here, again, to set this into context, and I think this was particularly true during the Cold War years, when you really had the separate models of the communist versus the capitalist. You had a generation that grew up knowing very little about religion overall. And it was a time when societies were becoming more plural, with movement and with the freedom of choice that is one of the issues in religious freedom that we can come back to, that you're not born and engraved on you what your religious tradition is. It's something that you, in a modern society, an ideal modern society, you have a choice. But you had this long period when graduate schools, including the one that I went to, taught very little about religion. People often knew even less about their own tradition than, say, about Islam. I'm still frustrated at Georgetown University that you can graduate, particularly in the graduate side, without really engaging with the fact that the world is in fact a profoundly religious place, and in, as many of us say, ferociously complex ways. So this question of answering what's religion got to do with it, why is religious freedom an important issue for Cuba now, does require some levels of religious literacy and respect and skepticism, whatever you like, but an understanding of the roles that religious institutions play. And that would be, I mean, that would include the Vatican's diplomatic roles in trying to resolve issues. It would include the roles in traditional education. It would ask questions about the healthcare systems in Cuba. All of these are what I put into this complicated basket of religious literacy. But I think it is, for all three of us, one of our central goals is not to encourage religious practice, but to demand, to require a sophisticated, thoughtful understanding of the roles of these kinds of institutions. So that's what we say, and what troubles us, and what's troubled Madeleine Albright and many others, is the fact that so many people who are dealing with these issues do not have the kinds of tools and background and context that are necessary and important. So that's the religious literacy. It's easier said than done, because you have to figure out, what does someone from the State Department really need to know? What about someone from UNICEF? What about UNHCR, the refugee organization? How do we help them to answer these basic questions of what is the religious landscape and what has to do with it? I have to say, the more I speak, the more I'm itching to do a religious landscape review on Cuba as well as other countries. The second issue is religious engagement. And there is actually quite a, I would almost say ferocious, but perhaps a heated debate going on as to the relationship between religious engagement and religious freedom. But in an ideal sense, religious engagement is a positive outreach. It means that in dealing with a country or a problem, whether it's childhood nutrition, or whether it is peace building or whatever, that you are reaching out to different religious communities in a given setting in a positive way, which means relationships, continuing relationships. So for example, in the Berkley Center, one of the issues that we're focused on right now is, what is the pattern? What are we learning from religious engagement in the COVID pandemic response, whether it is on vaccines, but also on hunger, on child protection, on gender rights, on et cetera. So in other words, the issue of religious engagement suggests that in international relations at the broad level, in other words, diplomacy, but also in a sector, health sector, whatever, that you are looking at the religious landscape and taking that into account. So for example, in Cuba, which has such remarkable progress on health care, what might we learn from engaging with religious actors who are dealing with healthcare about the Cuban experience? So it is, to some, broadening very substantially these questions about what's religion got to do with it, taking it from a concern about things that are wrong to a situation of where you're thinking much more proactively across, in my lexicon, the full sustainable development agenda. Which brings me to religious freedom. Now, of course, in the United States, and I'm not sure how far this was, any of you have focused on this, I haven't heard it yet. But in the United States, it really stands out among countries with, I would say, two major points that I think are important. The first is the 1998 legislation, which creates an ambassador for religious freedom responsible to the president, but sitting within the Department of State, and a religious freedom commission, which is bipartisan, and which puts the issues of religious freedom as a Central American policy objective. The second thing, which I think is remarkable, and Ahmed has referred to it in his conversation, is that the State Department is required to produce every single year a report on religious freedom in every country. And that includes Cuba. So, and it also is required to judge the severity of violations of religious freedom, which is one of the issues. I've just actually completed a report on the different methodologies that are used worldwide to look at these violations of religious freedom. So the United States has this apparatus which stands out internationally. No other country has the country by country annual reviews of religious freedom. But I think the point that I want to make, and at least touch on, in case I don't know if we want to come back to it, is that this legislation was approved unanimously by bipartisan agreement. In other words, it was seen as part of the four freedoms, Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms, the fundamental importance of freedom of conscience, freedom of worship. And yet, this is a topic that has become deeply polarized in the United States for a variety of complicated reasons that come back to what Ahmed was referring to before, which is the complex and highly diverse relationships between governments and religious institutions in different parts of the world. And in the United States, those issues of the wall of separation have come into question as to where that wall is and what it means. And it also has results from another comment that Ahmed made, which is this sense that, that it is only certain groups that are advocating for religious freedom, and not, as he has so movingly emphasized, and as I would emphasize, that these are integral parts of the human rights framework, and therefore linked to basic issues of freedom and liberty, our understandings of human rights, the right to speech, the right to assembly, the right to conscience. And from where I'm sitting, all of these questions take us in very short steps to the questions of the development model and the economic incentives, the approach to education, the approach to healthcare, the approach to disaster preparedness, to recovery from hurricanes, and to understandings of the responsibilities of the state to its citizens, which even in a country like Cuba, which has consciously worked to separate, clearly come together in many important ways. So I think I will stop there and listen with great interest to the questions and comments that my colleagues have.
Thank you very much, Professor Marshall, for those incredibly insightful comments. I think that raised so many great things for us to think through here together. I'm struck by, I was actually reviewing the State Department's report on Cuba right before this gathering, and seeing there exactly what you mentioned, this evaluation each year of, is Cuba complying or not? But you may know in late 2019, it was placed on a watch list by the United States for its violations of religious freedom as assessed by the United States. And this raises really interesting questions about how then the United States enforces that, how the United States thinks about its role. Do other countries share in its appraisal or not? Or is this something that's kind of the United States going it alone? So then in the international relations sphere, it's very interesting to think about who gets to be the arbiter of these things. But the comment I really wanted to just circle back on for a moment to respond a little bit on my own, then I'll maybe turn back to Dr. Shaheed, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience, was thinking about the larger context of Latin America and thinking where Cuba fits into that. And especially the important role played by religion in Latin America, in the context of Latin America and its long history. One where historically the Catholic Church played an outsized role, not only in organizing family life, local life, but in providing very important services, as you mentioned, schooling, healthcare, being a foundational actor in those spheres where that's been less the case in Cuba since the revolution. So that you see religion playing a different role there, but one still very important in terms of people's lives. I was thinking too about your comment about religious literacy, and you applied it mainly to actors, from outside looking at and analyzing countries. And I think that's an important critique, one that we should take to heart here at the School of Foreign Service, is how do we form future diplomats to understand religion abroad. But I also think about the religious literacy of people growing up in the context of Cuba and in the context of Latin America, which has had a rapidly changing religious landscape in the last 30 or 40 years, going from an absolute dominance by the Catholic Church to, in many countries, Protestantism is now larger than Catholicism. Evangelical Pentecostal churches have been growing at tremendous rates. There's more appreciation for indigenous religions. So thinking about this shifting landscape, and do we have actors who are trained to be attentive to that? We know that religion is still very much an organizing principle in many people's lives throughout the region, but especially in Cuba. And you see that in moments like the visit of the Pope when he came, or the important outsized role of the former cardinal there, Jaime Ortega, who was such an important diplomat, both locally and globally, in brokering relations between countries. So the Catholic Church has played this very important role, and other churches are coming to play important roles. How does the population learn about that, understand it, engage it, when there may be either a lack of education about it or active hostility towards those religious beliefs and practices? And, in most of Latin America, we don't see an outright hostility, but we do see some countries that have challenged the dominance of religious actors. I think of Mexico, with its strong anti-clerical tendencies, to really to be quite critical of the hierarchical church while embracing of or allowing of a more popular practice. And so thinking about how does popular practice relate to these larger institutional questions. All these are fabulous questions for us to think about. And I appreciate the way you laid them out, and Dr. Shaheed, the way you thought about some of the ways those are being violated today. So maybe why don't we, actually in the interest of time, I think it might make sense for us to go to questions because we've got just a little over 15 minutes left, if that's okay. Dr. Shaheed, did you have any comments though before we go to those questions that you maybe in response to either Professor Marshall or myself?
I think Professor Marshall Katherine made very pertinent and important points in regard to the fact that religion often appears to be a blind spot in international relations, but it's an important spot because of the important role religion plays positively and negatively, and therefore not being able to engage with that, it's not only missing a beat, but also comes at a high cost for many in many contexts. That is one. That, of course, is that the point, Reverend Matthew, regard to the region. Not only has religion played a key role in the life of, if you like, social and humanitarian life of the communities, but if you look at the way democracy had come into the region, the church played such a crucial role in ensuring it remained, if you like, the bulwark against dictatorship and fomented respect for rights and democracy. At the same time, of course, now we're seeing a much more diversified engagement with religion, a result, of course, of open societies, but then again, showing how active and robust that space has to be for democracy to thrive. And when that happens, religion has that space as well. Modernization, as we understand, the past 3-4 centuries has been driven largely by the creation of a civil society, which gave space for innovation and everything else. And that society is not based, even if, of course, civil is not based upon harmony or unity. It's based upon a very robust engagement of views, competing views, battling amongst views, of course, peacefully, but then a very robust and dynamic life. all opposed to the kind of harmony that many states seek to create by throwing out religion from the public space. So we have to accept that democracy and human rights and progress come through robust contestation peacefully. And that is the sort of space that we require through freedom of religion belief for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's now turn to the questions, and I'll take some of these from the Q&A, and I'd encourage others that have questions to keep typing them into the Q&A. Well, let's begin with this first question because it allows for a little comparative exercise. Dr. Shaheed, could you comment on John McCall's question? So how, comparing the situation for religious institutions in Cuba with the religious situation in other single party countries, maybe thinking of ideological allies like China or Vietnam, with which the US has, more normal diplomatic, cultural, and trade relations.
Right. I think, if you look at how these countries operate in the Human Rights Council, you see how well connected they are. They often defend each other. So there is that, if you like, a commonality of views and operation perspectives among these states. But really, Vietnam is mentioned here as an example. It's a very, very, difficult state for religious freedom. There've been some changes recently in terms of law, but in practice, nothing has changed. The state continues to control, faith-based organizations and of course deny registration for those that are more independent. So that control, feature is still there. Of course, China is possibly right now. Well, North Korea competes, but China is very much one of the worst offenders in this regard. And again, it's a same mindset that they have to control the civic space, that they cannot let competing ideologies emerge, and they therefore even are prepared to engage with, if you like, mind control in the case of China. But I think China, Vietnam, North Korea, other one-party states in this frame are all in the same sort of area. I mean, there can be a variation as to who is the worst offender there, but they all cannot tolerate religious freedom, and of course that comes along with the lack of appetite for any freedom at all.
Thank you. Let's actually move on to, I find a very interesting question here that it responds to one of Professor Marshall's comments. This is from Scott Olvey, and he says, can you talk about what you believe the role of businesses or business leaders might be in helping to achieve the items you mentioned, religious literacy, freedom, and engagement? Do you think the private sector has a role in this, Professor Marshall?
Yes, the answer is yes. And there are a lot of actually quite different and interesting in different ways initiatives within private firms to look at religious freedom broadly, but also to take more account of the religious beliefs and the religious practice of their employees, as well as the people who were affected. I would not venture to say that that's anything approaching a majority. In fact, I think that we would generally say that sort of having a self-conscious, explicitly articulated approach to of a range of religious matters is not something most private companies would be known for. But there are these very interesting initiatives, whether it's Spirit in Business or awards that are being given to some companies that are encouraging it. And I think I would put it into the broad objective of religious literacy, yes, but also human rights literacy. That we want, as the role of private enterprise in the global development field is increasing, that's where most of the money is coming from these days. The idea that sort of the private sector can operate in its own world, separate from the overseas development organizations, I think is dangerous as well as oversimplified. So having more efforts, which some companies are doing, to have sort of religious literacy, but also to be prepared, whether they're pushed or whether they're at the forefront, to sort of look at the ways in which the manifestations of religious freedom are exercised. And, again, we know that some of the main issues are the treatment of minorities within societies, but also, let's also be very clear, we're still in Women's Month, that a lot of it has to do with women's rights, the way women are treated, and both the positive and the less positive traditions that come with religious communities in family law and the way women are treated. So I think that there are a lot of ways in which these issues intersect, perhaps much more closely than people often anticipate or realize.
Thank you. And it occurs to me, I wonder if businesses too don't play a role in normalizing religious belief and practice when they recognize it in their employees or in their consumers that, oh, these people are also religious people, diversely religious, but that they're religious. I think that's one thing at Georgetown that we actually do pretty well, at least for our undergrads, is there's a sense that people can be religious. It's not something they have to hide, and they can talk about it. And in fact, they enjoy engaging across religions and learning about one another. I wonder if the private sphere sometimes does not acknowledge that very much and treats people as if they're cookie cutter consumers or cookie cutter employees. But by even just opening up the conversation, it gives a certain legitimacy and a normalcy to recognizing this. No, thank you. Let me turn to another question. This one is from Sue Bidwell, who's done something that I think none of us on the panel have done. She's visited Cuba. So she mentions that she visited Cuba in 2019, and she was told that religious freedom had improved since the Pope's visit. Dr. Shaheed, in your studies, have you observed that things have changed or gotten better since 2019? And then she asked a second question, asking about Cuban people often have very little access to money and especially hard currencies. So she asked about how religious communities are supported in Cuba and how that has been going. Maybe you could speak to that, Dr. Shaheed.
Right, thank you. The first question, if you observe trends in Cuba for the past several years, there's no real observable change no real significant change with regard to religious freedom. But there have been signs of hope among civil society actors that there is potential to achieve some improvement, largely driven by what they see as an increased vulnerability of the state to pressure from outside. Now, what the source of that, perhaps can be re-examined, but there's a sense that things can improve if there is more pressure on the country. Now, a papal visit does just that. It provides a huge amount of international exposure to the country in question, and most countries want to clean up before such a exposure is made, and they probably will remain in some kind of situation until that gaze goes away. So there may have been some change around the time, but nothing significant, and nothing has been of lasting impact. The country remains in a very, very serious situation. But that's why I think it's so important that events like today's event and other events keep focusing on what's happening in the country, and we enable country society actors to better articulate their concerns by documenting more effectively and promoting their findings globally. In terms of funding, I don't have accurate knowledge as to how that happens, but religious freedom provides the people right to solicit funds and benefit from voluntary financial resources. And of course, there isn't a large amount of funds coming into the country, but oftentimes they don't even require such large amounts to operate as well. But I don't have exact information as to precisely how this system survived there despite the restrictions put on the state on them by the state.
Dr. Shaheed, just to follow up on that, would you say that it's more complicated for newer religious organizations to transfer money and those sorts of things? I'm thinking about, established church like the Catholic Church might have more mechanisms for bringing funding in, where newer churches that were starting more local churches, would they face more challenges in the Cuban context? Is that your impression?
Well, Cuban context, any global context, well, not any, Cuban context and those contexts where there is restriction on religious freedom, it's the newer communities that survive, that face more challenges of all sorts, including from perhaps the communities in the country themselves. So countries, it's sort of minority persecution always picks up the most vulnerable person. It tends to do that. And therefore, the newer person, the smallest community are the most exposed ones, whereas the more established ones would have a variety of means of even bypassing the restrictions that are in place. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's the what are called non-mainline churches that often face these difficulties more than the established ones.
No, and that certainly seems to be the case in Cuba. At least that's, as I read reports about it. Let me ask you a question. Brian McCoy asked for a little more specifics about the kinds of resistance that established religions face in Cuba, beyond just the registration process. Has your investigation turned up some more resistances they faced or more limitations? Could you speak to that maybe, Dr. Shaheed?
Well, I speak without having gone to the country, and therefore there is that, if you like, veil of ignorance as it were between me and the ground situation. But I have not received reports. I mean, obviously there have been reports of, I think, I suppose public actor sponsored or public actor encouraged intercommunal, issues, individual issues. But beyond that, I have not heard of, if you like, resistance by established groups to newer groups. Although, of course, in any context, there would be concern about, I suppose, new players sort of, coming and occupying your space. But in the Cuban context, I haven't received information to this effect.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn back to Professor Marshall, if we may, for just a moment. One of our respondents asked about the language and tone used in the State Department's evaluation of religious freedom in the context of bilateral relations. Has anybody studied that, sort of the tone and language that the US has adopted in these documents and how that either changes in different contexts or different times? And what's your perception of that? That might be going beyond something you've studied, but it's an interesting question.
It's a good question. I think there have been some evaluations of the process, and I know that some of the ambassadors, each ambassador for religious freedom who comes in and who has a responsibility for that office has looked pretty systematically, because it's a large effort that's undertaken with a review of every country that is done by the embassies. And of course, part of the purpose is to encourage each US embassy to have continuing relationships with religious entities in that country. I have at different times read a lot of them, and I am often struck by how they change from year to year. Sometimes you can almost see that a different person has come in with different concerns. I know, for example, just to take a sort of bizarre off-the-wall example, but I was looking at the report on Japan recently, because I do tend to look at them. They're a good source if you're interested in a country. And I was expecting to find something about basically the evolution of government religious relationships, but instead what was there was the treatment of very small numbers of Rohingya and Uyghurs. That was sort of the issue of the year. So my sense is that for countries which are designated as CPCs, which is countries of particular concern, which basically goes to the White House, the president, the Secretary of State, has a lot of consequences in terms of sanctions, in terms of really the whole idea, of course, is that the restrictions or the violations of religious freedom become a matter of public policy, of diplomatic concern, that for those countries, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Myanmar, a number, North Korea, Cuba, those countries, clearly the reports will have a particular level of scrutiny, whereas one that's not necessarily on the front burner might not get the same level, but they certainly, I know, and actually in my report on the reporting on violations of religious freedom, we did interview a number of people in the State Department who are responsible for the report. So I can get you that reference if you're interested. And it's a very interesting and demanding process. And as I said, it's unique, but it's also somewhat heroic to try to look at the religious freedom, but also engagement issues worldwide every year.
Thank you very much. Now we've just got a moment left to really wrap up. I'd love it if each of you could just say, what's one thing you would hope someone would leave this conversation either thinking they should do next or read next or think about next? How could people become either better educated on this or take a step on this issue, recognizing that we've only touched the surface? So what would be the next step you would hope for? Maybe why don't I start with Dr. Shaheed, and then I'll come back to Professor Marshall.
Thank you. I think one would distinguish between a Cuban rights defender and an international one. For the Cuban rights defender, I think it's vitally important that they document rights violations and reach out to international actors who can amplify the concerns they have documented, because exposure matters to countries, and when exposure is made, they do really care. The way Cuba behaves in the council shows that it's not immune to criticism of the country. So that is an important one. For international actors, I think it's very important to recognize that there's a role all of us need to play here, to recognize that without approaching countries running in Cuba, then we actually creating a broader problem. And the entry point may not be FoRB as such. It may not be Article 18, but it can be other entry points as well. We discussed the role of business this afternoon. There can be other entry points through which we can come in regard to what's happening in the country, and then again put it back to the global stage. So in other words, network across the boundaries, and then look at mutual strengths, and then look at synergies that a local actor and international actor can combine to get together.
Thank you very much. And Professor Marshall, what would you leave as a charge for us?
I come away with a hunger to know more about the broader roles of religious entities in modern Cuba. Hope that will be part of the way that the Biden administration looks at relationships with Cuba, which is an important and unusual player in our hemisphere. So I think there's probably quite a lot more that we could learn, and that it might be beneficial to the people of Cuba, but also to the region more broadly.
Thank you. It occurs to me, following up on both of your comments, that there's a real opportunity for us to improve our literacy and knowledge about specific cases, and in this case, the Cuban case. And the more we can listen to voices on the ground there, and the more we can hear their experiences, and then bring that back to the fora in which we operate, universities, the United Nations, the State Department. It's going to be crucially important because the situation there is different from in other parts of the world. It's different from a few years ago. It's evolving. This is something we need to be really up and ready for. I'm very grateful to both of you for joining us. Thank you, Professor Marshall. Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Thank you to all of you who have been in attendance with us. As we mentioned, this will be recorded and put up on the Berkley Center website, so you can watch it there and pass it to others. And please join us for other events like this, where we'll continue to talk about these important topics. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.